On a rain-soaked evening in downtown Seattle, fate orchestrates an encounter that will unravel decades of buried truths. Michael Sullivan, once a promising architect now living on the streets, rushes to help a woman whose car has broken down in a dangerous part of town. In that moment, neither recognizes the other. He's too weathered by years of hardship, and she's transformed by success she keeps hidden from the world. But as he offers her his worn jacket, something stirs in the depths of memory. A summer evening 30 years ago, a similar gesture, a first love that seemed destined to last forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pioneer Square as Michael Sullivan gathered his few possessions from the alcove where he'd spent the night. His movements were practiced, efficient, the routine of a man who had learned to live with little, but refused to live without dignity. From a weathered backpack, he pulled out a leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. Inside, pristine architectural drawings contrasted sharply with their aged container. He traced his fingers over one sketch, a design for a sustainable homeless shelter that had won acclaim in architectural circles 15 years ago. Before everything fell apart, before his name became synonymous with scandal rather than innovation. The drawing was more than a reminder of his past. It was proof that he had once been someone else entirely. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan," called Sarah, a barista from the corner coffee shop. She held out a steaming cup. "Extra hot today. Looks like rain later." "Sarah, you're too kind." His voice carried the refined echo of his former life. "I'll pay you back when—" "Don't even think about it." She smiled warmly. "Your help with my college application was worth way more than coffee." Michael accepted the cup with a slight bow, a gesture that spoke of better days. As he sipped the coffee, he watched the morning crowd hurry past. Executives in tailored suits, tourists consulting phones, street vendors setting up their carts. He saw himself in their reflections, caught glimpses of the man he used to be, in their hurried strides and confident postures. Near the shelter where he sometimes volunteered, he paused to examine a building's facade. His architect's eye never rested. Even now, he could see the potential in every structure, how a simple change in design could make a space more welcoming, more human. He pulled out a small notebook and made a quick sketch, adding it to hundreds of others. Ideas that would likely never see construction, but kept his mind sharp, his skills intact. The shelter's director, Tom, was already unlocking the front door when Michael arrived. "There's our resident architect," Tom called out. "Got some kids coming in today who could use help with their math homework. You up for it?" Michael nodded, tucking away his portfolio. Here, his past didn't matter. What mattered were the small ways he could still make a difference, still use the education and skills that remained long after everything else had been stripped away. Inside the shelter, the familiar scent of industrial cleaner and morning coffee filled the air. Michael made his way to the small office he shared with other volunteers, setting his backpack down beside a desk covered in building plans and permit applications. Tom had been trying to get approval for an expansion of the shelter's facilities for months, and Michael had been quietly helping revise the proposals. He pulled out another portfolio from his backpack, this one containing his most recent work, detailed suggestions for improving the shelter's layout, maximizing space while creating areas that felt private and dignified. These weren't just drawings. They were his way of repaying the kindness this place had shown him when he first arrived 3 years ago, lost and broken after the scandal that had destroyed his career. The memory of that time still stung, headlines flashing across screens. Award-winning architect accused of design theft. His firm's collapse, the clients who abandoned him, the colleagues who turned their backs. He had tried to fight it, to prove his innocence, but the evidence seemed insurmountable. Someone had set him up perfectly, and he had never discovered who or why. A group of teenagers filtered into the study area, their backpacks bulging with textbooks. Michael recognized most of them, children of working parents who couldn't afford after-school programs. He'd been helping them with math and physics, subjects that came naturally to him from his years of architectural work. They greeted him with genuine warmth, no trace of judgment in their young faces. "Mr. S, can you help me with this geometry problem?" asked Marcus, a bright 15-year-old with dreams of becoming an engineer. "It's about calculating the surface area of a dome, and I keep getting stuck." Michael smiled, spreading out blank paper on the desk. "Let me show you how architects approach this kind of challenge." He began sketching, his hand steady and sure. In moments like these, teaching what he knew to the next generation, he felt echoes of his former purpose. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but he'd found ways to keep his skills alive, to pass on what he knew, to maintain his dignity, even when the world had tried to strip it away. As the morning progressed, more familiar faces arrived at the shelter, regulars, seeking warmth, newcomers looking lost and afraid, volunteers bringing donations. Michael moved among them with quiet authority, his presence a reminder that circumstances didn't define worth. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, and now he taught it every day, not through words but through actions. Chen adjusted her second-hand sweater and scuffed boots as she walked through Pike Place Market. The morning crowd parted around her, paying no attention to the woman who could have bought the entire historic marketplace with a single signature. She paused at a newspaper stand, her eyes catching on the latest Forbes magazine. Her company's logo splashed across the cover, though her own photo was notably absent. Hidden in her modest apartment safe, she kept a yellowed newspaper, clipping from 15 years ago. Seattle's phantom billionaire, the unseen force behind West Coast's largest development empire. The article had come dangerously close to exposing her identity, but she'd managed to bury it quickly. Now, it served as a reminder of why she chose this path of anonymity. "The usual Rebecca?" called Mario from his flower stall. She smiled, accepting the small bunch of daisies she bought every Wednesday. Simple flowers, nothing like the exotic arrangements that regularly graced her corporate boardroom. "How's your daughter's college application going?" she asked, knowing the answer but maintaining the fiction that she hadn't already arranged. "A full scholarship through one of her foundation's anonymous programs." "Still waiting to hear back," Mario sighed. "These schools, they don't make it easy for working folks." Rebecca nodded sympathetically, suppressing the urge to tell him the good news she knew would arrive in tomorrow's mail. This was her real life, these small interactions, these genuine connections, not the world of high-stakes business deals and corporate machinations she navigated behind the scenes. Her phone buzzed, not the basic model she carried for show, but the secure device hidden in her coat pocket. She stepped into a quiet alcove to check it. Emergency board meeting required. Hamilton Group, threatening hostile takeover. Rebecca closed her eyes, letting out a slow breath. The Hamilton Group, aggressive, ruthless, and completely unaware that the corporate collective they were trying to outmaneuver was essentially one woman working from a series of shell companies and brilliant market strategies. She typed a quick response. "Proceed with Protocol 17. The message would set in motion a complex series of financial maneuvers, all designed to protect not just her wealth, but the thousands of jobs and community projects that depended on her careful stewardship. Walking on, she reached the small coffee shop where she allowed herself one real indulgence, watching people live their lives unencumbered by the weight of billions. The barista knew her as Rebecca the freelance writer. A cover that explained her flexible schedule and modest lifestyle. "Working on any new stories?" the barista asked as she prepared Rebecca's simple drip coffee. "Just finished a piece on local business," Rebecca replied, the truth hidden in plain sight. She'd actually just concluded a deal that would preserve 3 historic buildings and create affordable housing units in the heart of downtown. Taking her coffee to her usual corner table, she pulled out a worn notebook. To any observer, she appeared to be just another aspiring writer working on her latest piece. In reality, she was reviewing complex financial projections that would determine the fate of several major development projects. The door chimed, and she looked up to see a group of construction workers enter, their reflective vests dusty from the morning's work. Her heart clenched. They were from the shelter renovation project she was secretly funding, the same shelter where she forced her thoughts away from that direction. 15 years was a long time to maintain such elaborate shields around her. Heart and identity. But moments like these tested her resolve. Every time she approved a new community project, every time she directed funds through her labyrinth of charitable foundations, she fought the urge to look for him. Her phone buzzed again, the public one this time, a reminder about the shelter's community board meeting tonight. She served on several such boards, carefully maintaining her image as a modestly successful freelancer who cared about local issues. These meetings were her way of seeing firsthand the impact of her larger decisions, of staying connected to the real world that her wealth could so easily have isolated her from. Finishing her coffee, she gathered her things, nodding goodbye, to the barista. Outside, Seattle's iconic rain had started again, and she deliberately left her umbrella in her bag. The rain made everyone equal, she'd always thought. Rich or poor, powerful or not, everyone got wet the same way. A sleek corporate car passed by, and she caught a glimpse of her corporate logo on its side. The same logo that adorned buildings. Across the city, that graced letterheads and business cards of employees who had never met their true boss. Sometimes she wondered what they would think if they knew the truth, that the corporate giant they worked for was run by a woman who bought her clothes from thrift stores and rode the public bus. But she'd learned long ago that wealth was like a spotlight. It didn't just illuminate, it blinded. People stopped seeing you and started seeing what you represented. After what happened with Michael, she cut off that thought. Some memories were better left in the past, like the life she could have had if things had been different. In the deepest corner of his backpack, wrapped in waterproof plastic, Michael kept a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. Tonight, in the quiet of the shelter's empty common room, he found himself pulling it out. The image was faded, its colors muted by time, but the moment remained vibrant in his memory. Senior prom, 1994. Two teenagers with bright eyes and brighter futures. He traced the edge of the photo, remembering how Rebecca had insisted on going to the local diner after the dance, still in their formal wear. She'd ordered cherry pie and had gotten filling on her borrowed dress. Instead of being upset, she'd laughed, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. "Life's too short to cry over pie stains," she'd said. Then, more seriously, "Promise me something. Michael, promise me we'll always be real with each other, no matter what happens, no matter how much money or success or failure comes our way." "I promise," he'd said, meaning it with all the certainty of youth. The irony of that promise wasn't lost on him now. They'd both failed to keep it, though in very different ways. He'd hidden his growing financial troubles from her in their final year of college, too proud to admit that his scholarship wasn't covering everything. And she, well, her secret had been bigger than he could have imagined. He remembered the day he'd discovered it. A chance glimpse of a business magazine in a dentist's office. Rebecca's father's company had gone bankrupt years ago, but somehow she was still attending the most expensive architecture program in the country. When he'd asked her about it, she'd deflected, changed the subject, kept him at arm's length for the first time in their relationship. The distance had grown from there. Small lies became larger ones. Trust, once broken, proved impossible to rebuild. By graduation, they were strangers sharing a history they could no longer talk about. A sound at the doorway made him look up. Tom stood there, holding a stack of permit applications. "Those old blueprints you were telling me about," Tom said. "The ones from your first major project. Think they'd help with the expansion proposal?" Michael carefully rewrapped the photo. Maybe. They were innovative for their time. Sustainable materials, community-centered spaces. He didn't add that they'd won him his first major award, or that Rebecca had been the first person he'd shown them to. "The board meets tonight," Tom continued. "They're reviewing all proposals. Could use your expertise." "I'll dig them out," Michael said. But his mind was already drifting back to another set of drawings, the ones he and Rebecca had worked on together in their final semester. A community center that would serve both homeless and housed populations, breaking down barriers through shared spaces and programs. He'd used elements of that design in his later work, the project that had made his reputation, and ultimately destroyed it. The accusation of stolen designs had seemed to come from nowhere, but the evidence had been overwhelming. Professional suicide in the architecture world. Now, looking back, he wondered about the timing. The allegations had surfaced just as he was about to expose some irregularities in his firm's handling of community development projects. He'd been investigating missing funds, properties that changed hands under suspicious circumstances. Earth. To Michael, Tom's voice broke through his thoughts. "You okay? You've got that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you're seeing buildings that don't exist yet." Michael managed a smile. "Just remembering some old designs. Sometimes the past has answers we forgot to look for." He pulled out his portfolio, leafing through to the community center plans. They were still solid, ahead of their time even. The shelter's expansion could benefit from these ideas, updated for current needs. "Tom," he said slowly, "what if we approach the expansion differently? Instead of just adding space, what if we created something that could change how people see shelters entirely?" As he spread the drawings across the table, explaining his vision, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The pure excitement of creation, unmarred by past failures or present circumstances. For a moment, he was that young architect, again, sharing ideas with the girl who'd believed in him before anyone else did. The photo lay forgotten in his backpack, but its memory lingered. Somewhere in this city, Rebecca was living a life he couldn't imagine. He hoped she'd found what she was looking for, even if it had meant leaving their shared dreams behind. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that across town, in a penthouse office hidden behind shell companies and corporate fronts, Rebecca was looking at her own copy of that same photograph, making decisions that would soon bring their paths crashing back together. The shelter's community room buzzed with nervous energy as board members filed in for the evening meeting. Michael sat in the back, his updated blueprints carefully rolled and tucked beside his chair. Tom had convinced him to present his ideas, though he'd be introduced simply as a volunteer with architectural experience. Rebecca slipped in just as the meeting was starting, taking her usual seat near the middle. She wore her carefully cultivated, concerned citizen outfit. Sensible. Shoes, modest sweater, minimal jewelry. The board chairman was already discussing the shelter's critical need for expansion when her secure phone vibrated. She glanced at it discreetly. Hamilton Group accessing sealed records from 2010 development projects. Her heart rate quickened. 2010, the year of Michael's scandal. She forced her attention back to the meeting, where the chairman was introducing the next speaker. "Our volunteer architectural consultant has prepared some innovative proposals for the expansion." Rebecca's breath caught as Michael stood up. He looked different, weathered, grayer, but his movement still held that familiar grace as he unrolled his blueprints across the presentation table. She fought to keep her expression neutral, even as her mind raced. Of all the shelters in Seattle, he'd ended up at this one, the one her foundation had specifically targeted for major renovation. "The key to this design," Michael was saying, his voice steady and professional, "is integration with the community. Instead of creating another institutional space, we can build something that serves multiple needs." His fingers traced the lines of his drawings, and Rebecca felt herself transported back to their college days. He'd always had this ability to make others see the possibilities hidden in empty spaces. The room leaned forward, caught by his quiet enthusiasm. Here, we create a courtyard that serves as both a gathering space and a teaching garden. The cafe area doubles as a job training facility. Every square foot serves multiple purposes, making the most of our limited footprint. Rebecca studied the blueprints from her seat, professional admiration mixing with personal anguish. The design was brilliant, exactly the kind of project her foundation desperately wanted to fund. But if she approved it, their paths would inevitably cross more directly. The Hamilton Group's threat loomed in her mind. If they were investigating the 2010 projects, they might uncover her connection to Michael's scandal, not her involvement. In causing it, she'd had nothing to do with that, but her failed attempts to help him afterward, the anonymous support he'd rejected, the truth she'd never been able to tell him. "Questions from the board?" the chairman asked. Rebecca raised her hand, keeping her voice carefully modulated. "The design is impressive, but what about funding? These materials, while sustainable, aren't cheap." Michael met her eyes for the first time, and for a heart-stopping moment she feared recognition, but he only saw another board member, another potential obstacle to overcome. "Actually," he replied, "I've done a complete cost analysis." He pulled out additional documents. Using local suppliers and incorporating job training programs into the construction itself, we can reduce costs significantly. I've also identified several grant opportunities. She listened as he outlined exactly the kind of proposal her foundation looked for, knowing she would have to support it. The project was too perfect, too aligned with her mission to reject simply because of personal complications. Tom stepped forward, adding his endorsement. "We've already received preliminary interest from several community partners." He didn't mention that the largest potential donor was sitting in the room, her wealth hidden behind layers of corporate anonymity. After the meeting, Rebecca lingered, watching Michael roll up his blueprints. His hands moved with the same precision she remembered, though now they showed signs of hard times, small scars, roughened skin. She wanted to approach him to say, what? That she was sorry, that she'd tried to help, that she still... Her secure phone buzzed again. Hamilton Group requesting meeting. Claimed to have significant information about Chen developments early in projects. She left quickly, before the urge to reveal herself became overwhelming. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of rain, the same scent that had filled the air the night of their prom, when everything had seemed possible and promises had felt unbreakable. In her car, the modest hybrid she drove for her public persona, she made a decision. She couldn't undo the past, but she could try to right some of its wrongs. She pulled out her other phone, the one connected to her empire, and sent a message to her foundation's board. Proceed with full funding for the shelter expansion, priority status, and watch for any inquiries about 2010 development projects. Flag everything for my personal review. What she didn't write, couldn't write, was the real reason for her interest, because this time I won't let him fall. Back in her penthouse office, Rebecca pressed her palm against the biometric scanner hidden behind a modest landscape painting. The wall panel slid open silently, revealing her private sanctuary, the one place where she didn't have to pretend. Among the carefully organized files and secure servers sat a small leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age. Her diary from senior year of college. She hadn't opened it in years, but tonight, seeing Michael again had broken all her carefully constructed barriers. Her hands trembled as she lifted it from its shelf. May 15th, 1998, she read. Michael showed me his community center designs today. He has this way of seeing possibilities that no one else does. The way he talked about creating spaces that could bring people together, break down barriers between social classes. I wanted to tell him then about the money, about who I really am, but I saw how proud he was of doing everything on his own merit, and I couldn't bear to change how he saw me. She flipped through more pages, memories flooding back. Their last summer together, the growing distance, the final fight. Then the later entries, after she'd inherited her mother's hidden fortune and business empire at 25. The careful construction of her double life, designed to protect her from those who would only see her wealth. A notification popped up on her secure monitor, detailed background report on the shelter's architectural volunteer. She opened it, though she already knew what she'd find. The photograph confirmed it. Michael Sullivan, the same man who'd captured her heart decades ago, now listed as homeless, his brilliant career destroyed by that scandal. But there was more. The report outlined his activities at the shelter, tutoring kids in math, helping with grant proposals, quietly using his architectural expertise to improve lives. Even at his lowest point, he was still trying to make a difference. Her computer chimed again. The Hamilton Group's investigation was getting closer to uncovering the connection between her company and the projects from 2010. She pulled up the old files, the ones she'd sealed away. The evidence that had destroyed Michael's career had been expertly fabricated. She saw that now with years of business experience. Someone had wanted him silenced, and they'd succeeded. She turned back to her diary, to an entry from just after the scandal broke. October 3, 2010. Tried to help through the foundation, but he refused the grant. He said he didn't want charity, that he'd rebuild on his own merit. If he knew it was. Me behind the offer, but that's impossible now. The papers are calling it the biggest architecture scandal of the decade. I could clear his name with one press conference, reveal everything, but then the whole house of cards would collapse. Thousands of jobs depend on maintaining the corporate structure exactly as Mother designed it. I've never felt more trapped by this secret life. A soft ping from her phone interrupted her reading. A message from the shelter's board. They needed the funding commitment finalized by the end of the week. Her own deadline coming back to haunt her. She stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seattle's lights glittered below, many of them shining from buildings her company owned, buildings that could have borne Michael's designs if things had been different. The diary lay open on her desk, its pages a testament to roads not taken. She picked it up again, turning to the last entry from their time together. September 12, 1998. Ended things with Michael today. He knew I was keeping something from him, could see it in his eyes. No more secrets. He'd made me promise once. Another promise broken. But better he think I betrayed his trust than know the whole truth. Better a clean break than watching him realize everything he loved about me was a lie. Rebecca closed the diary. Her decision made. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future. She turned to her computer and began composing 2 messages. The first, from her public email, was a formal letter of support for the shelter's expansion, signed with her modest board member identity. The second, from her secure server, set in motion a deeper investigation into the 2010 scandal. Someone had orchestrated Michael's downfall, and they had done it to protect themselves from his investigation into those missing funds. After 15 years, it was time to uncover the truth. What she didn't write in either message was how seeing him again had shaken her carefully constructed world. How his voice still carried the same passion for creating spaces that could change lives. How much she wanted to cross that room, look into his eyes, and finally speak the truth. Instead, she returned the diary to its hiding place, straightened her simple sweater, and prepared to return to her public role. She had learned long ago that sometimes love meant protecting people from a distance, even if every fiber of your being yearned to draw them close. Late that night, in the quiet of his shelter office, Michael unrolled a set of drawings he hadn't looked at in 15 years. The Peterson competition entry, his masterpiece and his downfall. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the lines remained crisp, the vision clear, a revolutionary approach to urban renewal that had won him the prestigious award and then destroyed everything. He traced the innovative elements that had made it special, the integrated green spaces, the mixed-income housing units, the community facilities that dissolved boundaries between social classes. And there, in the corner, his signature, alongside. The date, 1 week before his world imploded. Couldn't sleep either. He looked up to find Tom in the doorway, holding 2 cups of vending machine coffee. "Just reviewing some old work," Michael said, accepting a cup. Tom studied the drawings. "This was it, wasn't it? The project that ended my career?" "Yeah." Michael took a sip of the bitter coffee. "You know what's ironic? I found irregularities in the development company's books while researching background for the project. Properties being bought and sold through shell companies, money disappearing from community improvement funds. Did you ever figure out who was behind it? Got close, started tracking a pattern of similar deals across the West Coast, all tied to something called the Chen Group." He laughed quietly. "Next thing I knew, I was being accused of stealing designs from a competitor. The evidence seemed airtight. Preliminary sketches dated months before mine. Witnesses who claimed they'd seen my work on the other firm's computers." Tom leaned in, examining the drawings more closely. "But these concepts, they're clearly evolved from your earlier work. The community center designs you showed me last week, I can see the same principles." Didn't matter. The media loved the story. Rising star architect revealed as fraud. My firm's clients pulled out overnight. No one would touch me after that. Michael rolled up the drawings carefully. The investigation I'd started into the missing funds, buried in the scandal. Across town, Rebecca sat in her hidden office, surrounded by screens displaying the same investigation from a different angle. The Hamilton Group's threats had led her to dig deeper into her own company's history, and what she'd found made her blood run cold. The shell companies Michael had been investigating, they weren't just similar to her mother's business structure, they were part of it, but the dates were wrong. These transactions had happened after her mother's death. During the years Rebecca had been gradually taking control of the empire. She pulled up the records from 2010. There, a series of property deals authorized by someone with high-level access to the Chen Group's accounts. But she hadn't approved them. She hadn't even known about them. Her phone rang, her private line, that only 3 people had access to. Ms. Chen, her head of security's voice was tense. "We've found something. The authorization codes used for those 2010 transactions, they belonged to Robert Marshall." Rebecca's grip tightened on the phone. Marshall, her mother's most trusted advisor, the man who'd helped Rebecca maintain her anonymous control of the company, the man who'd insisted they distance themselves from the Sullivan scandal. "There's more," her security chief continued. "Marshall didn't just authorize the deals. He orchestrated the entire campaign against Sullivan. We found emails, payments to the witnesses, even the fabricated design sketches used to frame him." Rebecca closed her eyes, pieces falling into place. Marshall must have discovered Michael's investigation, realized it would lead back to his embezzlement. He'd used her mother's systems, her company's resources, to destroy an innocent man's life and protect his own crimes. And she'd let it happen. Had even convinced herself it was necessary to maintain her secrecy, her careful separation of worlds. On her desk, another screen lit up with an alert. The Hamilton Group had scheduled a press conference for the following week. Subject: historical irregularities in Chen development practices. They knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to threaten her entire carefully constructed existence. If they exposed Marshall's crimes, her connection to Michael's scandal would come out too. Her dual identity, her years of hidden control over the company, all of it could crumble. Unless... She turned to her computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as she began composing 2 messages. The first, to her legal team: prepare full disclosure of Marshall's activities. Priority 1. The second was harder to write. She stared at the blank screen for a long moment before beginning. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, the truth about the Peterson competition scandal has finally come to light." In his shelter office, Michael was still studying his old drawings when Tom returned with a printout. "You need to see this," Tom said, handing him a news release. "The Hamilton Group is claiming they've uncovered evidence about your case. Something about corporate fraud and false accusations. Michael scanned the document, his heart pounding. After 15 years, was the truth finally going to come out? What he didn't know was that across the city, Rebecca was setting in motion events that would either heal their shared past or shatter both their worlds completely. The document sat on Rebecca's desk like a living thing, the Sullivan Architecture Innovation Trust. Her lawyers had drafted it perfectly. An anonymous fund dedicated to supporting architects focused on community development. The selection criteria exactly matched Michael's expertise and current situation, but with enough flexibility to seem coincidental. "Are you sure about this?" her chief counsel asked through the secure line. "Once it's established, the trust becomes public. Record. Someone might make the connection." Rebecca studied the signature line, awaiting her authorization. "We don't have a choice. The Hamilton Group's press conference is in 3 days. If we don't get ahead of this, there are other ways to handle it. Marshall's activities, no." Rebecca's voice hardened. "I'm done hiding the truth. Set up the trust immediately. And make sure the first grant notification reaches the shelter's board today." At the shelter, Michael sat with Tom reviewing the unexpected email. A new architectural trust was offering substantial funding for the expansion project, with additional support for the architect in charge. "It's perfect timing," Tom said. "With this kind of backing, we could break ground by spring." Michael frowned at the document. "It feels too perfect. A trust that specifically funds homeless shelter architects? How many of us could there be? Maybe someone read about our project. Your designs have been generating buzz in the community. Maybe, but something nagged at Michael's instincts. The trust's mission statement echoed phrases from his old work, concepts he'd written about in articles years ago. "I need to think about it." He walked through the shelter's common room, where residents were gathering for lunch. A teenage girl. He waved from her usual study spot. "Mr. S, I got an A on my geometry test." He managed a smile, pushing aside his suspicions to celebrate her success. This was what mattered. The small victories, the lives he could still touch even without his former status. His phone buzzed. An alert about the Hamilton Group's upcoming press conference. Something about corporate fraud investigations. He'd stopped following architecture news years ago, but this caught his attention. In her office, Rebecca received another urgent message. The Hamilton Group had moved their press conference up by 2 days. Her pulse quickened. They were forcing her hand. She opened a secure browser, accessing the trust's public records. The funding was in place, the paperwork ready. All it needed was Michael's acceptance. She thought of his pride, how he'd always insisted on making his own way. Would he reject this help like he had 15 years ago? The shelter's evening board meeting would discuss the trust's offer. Rebecca checked her appearance in the mirror, adjusting her modest outfit. Just another community board member there to support a good cause. She arrived to find Michael already there, studying the trust documents with an architect's attention to detail. "The language here," he was saying to Tom, "about innovative, community-centered design. I wrote almost exactly those words in a paper for the Peterson competition." Rebecca's heart stopped. She hadn't been careful enough, had let her memory of his words influence the trust's language. "Maybe they read your work," Tom suggested. "You were pretty well known before I was accused of stealing designs." Michael's voice was quiet. "That's what bothers me. This trust, it's like someone created it specifically for me. But why now, after 15 years? Rebecca wanted to speak up, to explain everything. Instead, she watched him trace the lines of legal text with the same care he once used on blueprints. "The Hamilton Group's investigation," he mused. "The timing of this trust. They're connected somehow." He was too close to the truth. Rebecca's phone buzzed. Another message from her security team. Marshall had booked a flight to the Caymans, due to leave tomorrow morning. She had to make a decision. Let Michael reject the trust and risk losing him again, or reveal herself and risk losing everything she'd built. The shelter's director called the meeting to order. "First item, The Sullivan Architecture Innovation Trust offer. We need to vote on acceptance. Rebecca raised her hand, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Before we vote, there's something you all need to know. Michael looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment she saw a flicker of recognition, not of her current self, but of the girl she'd been, the one who'd promised no more secrets. The truth was about to change everything. But maybe, she thought, it was time for change. The shelter's community room fell silent as Rebecca stood, but before she could speak, the door burst open. Her security chief, in his public role as a Foundation representative, rushed in. "Ms. Chen, we have an emergency at the main office." The room's attention shifted. Rebecca felt the moment slipping away, her chance at truth derailed by the very secret she maintained. "I apologize," she said, settling back into her chair. "My comment can wait." Michael watched the exchange with growing interest. Something about the woman's voice had stirred old memories, but the thought scattered as Tom spread the renovation plans across the table. "Let's focus on the immediate decision," Tom said. "These plans represent our future." He gestured to the detailed drawings Michael had prepared, now supplemented with cost analyses and implementation schedules. The blueprints told a story beyond mere construction. Each line represented a chance for renewal, not just for the building, but for its residents. A teaching kitchen where culinary skills could be learned, a computer lab doubling as a classroom, workshop spaces where trades could be taught. The Trust's funding would cover everything, Tom continued, including fair compensation for our architect. Michael tensed at that last part. "I didn't design this for money." "No," Rebecca found herself saying, "you designed it to make a difference, just like you always have." He looked at her sharply, and she realized her mistake. The words, the tone, too familiar, too knowing. But the renovation plans saved her, drawing attention back to their detailed promise. The shelter's current residents gathered around, seeing their future in the carefully drafted spaces. "Here," Michael explained, his passion overriding his suspicion, "the courtyard becomes a gathering space. The walls are glass, but with a special coating that creates privacy while maintaining openness. No more institutional barriers." Rebecca remembered similar words from their college days, his constant drive to break down walls between people. The irony of her own walls wasn't lost on her. Tom pointed to a section of the plans. "What about the old storage room, the one with all those boxes of records?" "Converting it to transitional housing units," Michael said. "Though we'll need to catalog everything stored there first." Rebecca's pulse quickened. She knew what was in those boxes. Her foundation had used the room for document storage years ago, including records from 2010. "I can help with that," she offered quickly. Too quickly. Michael's eyes narrowed. "You seem very interested in our records." "I just want to help," she said, the words echoing across 15 years. The plans between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken tensions. In the margins, Michael had sketched small details, the same kind of human touches he'd added to their college projects, a bench placed to catch the morning sun, a corner garden where residents could grow herbs. "The Trust," he said suddenly. "It matches these designs perfectly, almost as if someone knew exactly what we were planning." Before Rebecca could respond, her phone buzzed again. Marshall's flight had been moved up. He was heading to the airport now. She stood abruptly. "I need to make a call." In the hallway, she spoke urgently with her security team. "Stop him, whatever it takes." When she returned, the room had shifted, focused to the implementation timeline. But Michael was watching her, really seeing her for the first time. "You know," he said quietly, "I had a friend once who could never sit still when she was keeping secrets. She used to leave rooms suddenly. Just like that." Rebecca met his gaze. The walls she'd built so carefully were cracking in the plans. Before them, his design promised transparency, connection, hope, everything her own life had sacrificed in the name of protection. "The Trust," she said finally, "isn't just about the shelter. I know." His voice was gentle, stirring memories. of late-night study sessions and shared dreams. The question is, why now? Before she could answer, her security chief reappeared, face grave. Ms. Chen, Marshall's gone, and he took files with him, everything about the 2010 projects. The room stilled. On the table, the renovation plans waited, their promise of transformation, now entangled with the past, rushing to meet them. Michael looked from the plans to Rebecca, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Chen," he whispered, "all this time." The walls were finally coming down, but Rebecca wasn't sure either of them were ready for what lay behind them. The shelter's storage room felt smaller with both of them inside it, the air heavy with unspoken words. Michael methodically sorted through boxes while Rebecca stood frozen, knowing exactly which one contained the past she'd hidden away. "Rebecca Chen," he said finally, her full name carrying the weight of decades. The mysterious billionaire behind the West Coast's largest development company. "I never made the connection. Would it have mattered if you had?" She touched a dusty box, remembering what lay inside. "You tell me. You're the one who's been watching me from behind boardroom walls for 15 years. Before she could respond, his hand emerged from a box with a bundle of envelopes, aged and tied with a faded blue ribbon, her handwriting on the front of each one. "I thought I'd lost these," he said softly. "I found them in your office. After everything fell apart, I couldn't bear to throw them away." He untied the ribbon carefully. The first letter was dated September 1997, their junior year of college. "Dear Michael," he read, "your latest designs are brilliant. The way you see spaces, not just as buildings, but as possibilities for connection. Sometimes I watch you work and think about telling you everything, about who I really am, about the weight of secrets I carry." "Stop." Her voice cracked. "Please." But he was already opening another letter. "The trust fund kids in my business class talk about development like it's just numbers on paper. But you understand what I never could explain to them. That every building shapes lives, that architecture isn't about walls, but about the spaces between them." "I meant every word," she whispered. "Did you?" He looked up, his eyes carrying years of hurt. "You wrote about truth while living a lie. You watched my career be destroyed and said nothing. I tried to help. With money, anonymous grants, more secrets and shadows." He gestured at the renovation plans rolled up in the corner. "Even now, you're trying to fix things from behind a curtain." Rebecca reached into the box and pulled out one last letter, unopened. "This is why I couldn't tell you then. Why I still—" He took the envelope. The seal was unbroken, the paper creased from being carried but never read. The date, October 4, 2010, the day after the scandal broke. "I came to your office that night," she said, "to explain everything, but you were already gone." Michael stared at the letter for a long moment before breaking the seal. As he read, Rebecca watched 15 years of anger and confusion war across his face. "Marshall," he said finally, "your mother's advisor, he was behind it all? He found out you were investigating the missing funds, used my mother's companies to frame you. I didn't know then, but when I figured it out," she swallowed hard. "By that time, you'd disappeared. And now, why reveal everything now? Because Marshall's running. Because the Hamilton Group is about to expose everything. Because—" She touched the stack of letters. "Because every time I wrote to you, I promised myself it would be the last secret I'd keep." Outside the storage room, they could hear the shelter coming to life. Morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting their shadows against the renovation plans on the wall. "All those years," Michael said, "I thought I'd lost everything. My career, my reputation, my—" He looked at her. "But you lost something too, didn't you?" Rebecca nodded, tears threatening. "The only person who ever loved me for myself, not my money or power, the only one I could never buy back." The letters lay between them on a wooden crate, their pages holding years of unspoken truths. Through the window, they could see the shelter's courtyard, where Michael's new design promised to break down walls and bring people together. "What happens now?" she asked. Michael picked up the renovation plans, his architect's eyes finding the spaces between the lines. Now? Now we build something true. Rebecca's secure phone erupted with alerts as they left the storage room. Her security chief's message was urgent. Marshall accessed the core servers before leaving. He's downloaded everything, all the shell company structures, the hidden ownership, records, everything that maintains your anonymity. In her hidden office, 30 minutes later, the scope of Marshall's betrayal unfolded across multiple screens. The corporate takeover documents told a damning story. He'd been preparing this for years, building a parallel structure of companies designed to seize control once her identity was exposed. He's demanding a meeting, her chief counsel reported. Says if you don't sign over controlling interest in the major development subsidiaries, he'll release everything, including proof that you knew about his role in the Sullivan scandal. That's a lie, Michael said from where he stood examining the documents. After their confrontation in the storage room, she'd brought him here, into the heart of her hidden world. Of course it is, Rebecca replied, but perception is everything in corporate warfare. Even a hint of involvement would destroy public trust. She pulled up more files. Look at this. He's been siphoning funds for years, using the same methods. You almost exposed in 2010. Michael studied the complex web of transactions. He didn't just frame me. He used my disgrace as cover to expand his operation. Ms. Chen, her security chief interrupted. The Hamilton Group just moved their press conference up again. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Rebecca's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up more documents. Marshall knew they were close. That's why he's forcing my hand now. She turned to Michael. I need your help. You saw the pattern in 2010. Help me find it again. He hesitated only a moment before pulling up a chair. Together, they began tracing the labyrinth of Marshall's deception. Michael's architectural training gave him a unique perspective on the structure of the fraud. Here, he pointed to a series of transactions. He's using the same principle as a cantilever, each illegal deal balanced by a legitimate one. But look at the dates. Rebecca leaned in, their shoulders touching. The shelter renovation projects. He's been using them to hide the money trail. Not just hiding it, building it. Michael's voice carried the same intensity he used when explaining his designs. Each community project creates goodwill, public support, the perfect shield for what's happening behind the scenes. A new alert flashed. Marshall had landed in the Caymans. He's going to transfer everything offshore, Rebecca realized. Once that happens, you'll lose it all. Michael understood the stakes now. The company, the foundation, your ability to help people. She met his eyes. I don't care about losing the money, but the shelter projects, the community development funds, the people who depend on them. Then we stop him. Michael pulled up the renovation plans he'd brought with them. You taught me something all those years ago. Every structure has a weak point, even ones built on lies. They worked through the night, their old rhythm returning as they traced Marshall's paper trail. Each document revealed another layer of his scheme, but also its vulnerabilities. Dawn found them surrounded by virtual and physical papers, cups of cold coffee scattered among the evidence of Marshall's crimes. Rebecca's security team had located his position, a private bank known for its discretion. He'll move the funds as soon as they open, her chief counsel warned. We have maybe 2 hours. Rebecca stared at the corporate takeover documents. Marshall's final betrayal laid bare in legal language. Beside them lay Michael's renovation plans, their honest purpose a stark contrast. All these years, she said softly, I've hidden behind corporate walls, thinking I was protecting something important. But I was just afraid. Afraid of people seeing the real me, afraid of facing what happened to you. Michael touched her hand, the first personal contact since their confrontation. I spent 15 years believing I'd lost everything because I trusted the wrong people. Maybe we both need to tear down some walls. Her phone buzzed. The Hamilton Group had released their press conference agenda. The first item, corporate Fraud and architecture, the Sullivan scandal revisited. Rebecca straightened, decision made. Get me a secure line to the Hamilton Group and contact every major news outlet. It's time to step into the light. What are you going to do? Michael asked, though he already knew. Exactly what you taught me about architecture. Create something transparent, something true. She began typing. But first, we're going to stop Marshall, together. The sun rose over Seattle as they prepared for battle, their shared past finally becoming a foundation for the future, rather than a wall between them. The first hint something was wrong came as they prepared for the press conference. Rebecca reached for her secure phone and missed, her hand trembling slightly. She covered it quickly, but Michael had already noticed. "You okay?" "Just tired," she said, but her hand strayed to her bag, where a folded medical report lay hidden beneath her simple cardigan. Stage 3, the diagnosis read. Aggressive but treatable, if she started immediately. That had been 3 weeks ago. She'd missed 2 appointments already, 2 focused on the Marshall crisis and the shelter project. Her oncologist's words echoed. "Time is critical, Ms. Chen." "Rebecca?" Michael's voice pulled her back. "The Hamilton Group is on line 2. She straightened, pushing aside the fatigue that had been growing steadily worse. "Put them through." As she negotiated with the Hamilton Group, explaining their evidence against Marshall, Michael noticed more signs. The pallor beneath her makeup, the way she leaned on the desk for support, the untouched coffee growing cold. The call ended with a temporary agreement. The Hamilton Group would delay their press conference 24 hours, giving Rebecca time to stop Marshall's financial transfers. "That buys us some time," she said, then swayed slightly. Michael caught her arm. "What's really going on?" "I'm fine," she started, but her bag chose that moment to fall, spilling its contents. The medical report slid across the floor, landing face up at Michael's feet. He picked it up before she could reach it. His face changed as he read, Architect's eyes taking in every detail, just as they had with Marshall's documents. 3 weeks, he said quietly. "You've known for 3 weeks, and you're not in treatment." "There hasn't been time." "Marshall could have been handled by your team." The shelter project needed to be finished. She took the report back, folding it carefully. "Everything needed to be secured before..." "Before what?" "Before you'd allow yourself to be human." The anger in his voice surprised them both. 15 years ago, you hid behind wealth and power. Now, you're hiding behind responsibilities. "I'm not hiding. I'm protecting." "Who? The company? The foundation?" He gestured at the screens showing Marshall's fraud. "All of this means nothing if you're not here to see it through." Rebecca sank into her chair, the weight of secrets finally too heavy to bear. "I watched my mother die of the same thing. Watched her prioritize the company until it was too late. I promised myself I'd be different, but you're doing exactly what she did." Michael's voice softened. "Running an empire from behind a curtain while your real life slips away." Her security chief appeared in the doorway with more urgent updates, but Michael waved him away. "The difference," he continued, "is that your mother did it alone. You don't have to." "Michael, I spent 15 years thinking I'd lost everything, career, reputation, love. But sitting in that shelter, teaching kids about architecture, I learned something. Nothing we build matters if we forget why we're building it." He picked up his renovation plans, still scattered among the corporate documents. "Every line here, every space. It's about giving people a chance to rebuild. Maybe it's time you took that chance yourself." Rebecca looked at the medical report, then at the empire she'd built. Marshall's betrayal, the Hamilton Group's investigation, the shelter project. It had all seemed so urgent. But now, seeing her reflection in Michael's eyes, she recognized her mother's pattern, the constant sacrifice of present joy for future security. Her phone buzzed again. Marshall's bank would open in 1 hour. "I can't just stop," she said. "Too many people depend on you being alive to help them." Michael's hand found hers. "The Rebecca I knew once taught me that true architecture creates spaces for life to happen. When did you stop believing that? She thought of the shelter residents, how they fought daily battles nobody saw, how they kept going, kept hoping, kept trying to rebuild. There's a treatment center, she said finally, associated with the university hospital. They're doing innovative work with cases like mine. Then that's our first stop. Michael was already reaching for his phone. Your team can handle Marshall for a few hours. The press conference will mean more when you're strong enough to face it. He smiled slightly. Besides, I have some experience with public scandal. Sometimes the best defense is simply telling the truth. Rebecca looked around her hidden office, at the walls she'd built to protect herself. Through the windows, Seattle was waking up, its people emerging to face their own battles, seen and unseen. "Okay," she whispered, then stronger, "Okay." She stood, gathering her strength. There would be time for corporate wars and public revelations. Time to face Marshall's betrayal and rebuild what he'd tried to destroy. But first, she had to do what she'd been teaching others at the shelter: admit she needed help and accept it when offered. The treatment center's waiting room felt different from the corporate offices Rebecca usually inhabited. Here, wealth and status meant nothing. She watched a young mother comfort her child. An elderly man read a dog-eared novel. A teenager scrolled through her phone with forced casualness. All fighting their own battles, all waiting for news that could change everything. Michael sat beside her, reviewing a folder of shelter success stories he'd brought from his office. "Remember Marcus, the kid I was helping with geometry?" Rebecca welcomed the distraction. "The one who wants to be an engineer. He just got early acceptance to Washington State. Full scholarship." Michael showed her a photo of Marcus standing proudly in front of the shelter's entrance. "He's already talking about coming back to help design the new edition." The stories filled page after page. A former chef who'd lost everything to addiction, now running the shelter's culinary training program. A retired teacher who'd become homeless after medical bills bankrupted her, now coordinating education programs. Each story a testament to resilience, to the possibility of rebuilding. "Ms. Chen," a nurse appeared with a clipboard. "We're ready for you." Rebecca tensed. Michael squeezed her hand. "Want me to come with you?" She started to refuse, automatically then stopped. "Yes, please." The oncologist's office was warm, humanized by photos of family and thank you cards from patients. Dr. Sarah Martinez studied Rebecca's file, then looked up with direct compassion. "The good news is, we caught it relatively early. The challenging news is we need to start aggressive treatment immediately." Rebecca nodded, her business instincts taking over. "What's the timeline?" "I have some situations that need the timeline." Dr. Martinez interrupted gently. "Is now, today, cancer doesn't negotiate, Ms. Chen." Michael pulled out the shelter success stories again. "Show her the letter from Annie." Rebecca took the worn page. Annie had arrived at the shelter 6 months ago, after her own cancer treatment left her unemployed and homeless. But the story didn't end there. With the shelter's support, she'd found work as a patient advocate, using her experience to help others navigate the healthcare system. "The hardest part," Rebecca read aloud, "wasn't the cancer. It was admitting I couldn't fight it alone." Her phone buzzed. Her security team had located Marshall's exact position. The bank would open in 30 minutes. "I can't just abandon everything," she said. "People are counting on me." "They're counting on you to survive," Michael countered. He turned to Dr. Martinez. "What's the first step?" The doctor outlined an immediate treatment plan. Rebecca listened with the same focus. She'd give a corporate merger. But her hand kept straying to Annie's letter. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the office window, they could see the young mother from the waiting room hugging her child, both crying with joy. Good news, Rebecca realized, a future reclaimed. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't check it. Instead, she looked at the success stories spread across her lap. Each one represented a person who'd faced their own impossible moment and chosen to keep going. "When can we start?" she asked Dr. Martinez. "I can have you in treatment within the hour." Rebecca turned to Michael. "Marshall, let me make some calls." He stepped out, returning minutes later. Your security team is coordinating with financial authorities in the Caymans. The Hamilton Group agreed to share their evidence. He won't get away. A nurse appeared with admission papers. Rebecca stared at the signature line, remembering another set of documents waiting in her office, the ones that would expose her identity to the world. Sign them, Michael said softly. Everything else can wait. She did, feeling the same sense of commitment she'd experienced when signing the shelter renovation approval. Both signatures promising a different kind of future. As they prepared her for treatment, Rebecca watched Michael arrange the success stories on her bedside table. The shelter residents smiled from their photos, each one a reminder that rock bottom could become a foundation. Tell me more about Marcus's engineering dreams, she said, as the medication began to flow. Michael pulled his chair closer, speaking of hope and blueprints and young minds discovering their potential. His voice anchored her as medicine waged war with her cells, reminding her that every brick laid at rock bottom could become part of the climb back up. Outside her window, Seattle's afternoon light caught the windows of buildings she owned, but had never truly occupied. Soon, she would step out of their shadows. But for now, she let herself be simply human, held by the same hope that had lifted so many others at the shelter. Somewhere in the Cayman Islands, a bank was opening its doors, but here, in this room, a different kind of shelter was being built. One story, one treatment, one moment of grace at a time. 2 weeks into Rebecca's treatment, Dr. Martinez arrived with a thick folder of research papers. There's a new trial protocol, she explained, spreading the documents across the hospital table. Specifically designed for aggressive cases like yours. Rebecca studied the medical diagrams with the same intensity she once gave architectural plans. The treatment was experimental, combining immunotherapy with targeted radiation. The success rates were promising, but the side effects significant. Michael, who had hardly left her side except to check on the shelter, examined the consent forms. It's your decision, he said quietly. But these results, he didn't need to finish. The standard treatment wasn't working as well as they'd hoped. Rebecca's cancer was proving as stubborn as its host. Her secure phone buzzed from the bedside. Table. Marshall had been located in Singapore, but local authorities were hesitant to act without more evidence. The Hamilton Group's press conference had been delayed again, but rumors were starting to circulate. Life's funny, Rebecca said, touching. The experimental protocol papers. I spent years calculating every risk, controlling every variable. Now here I am, about to sign up for something with no guaranteed outcome. Sounds like someone I used to know, Michael smiled. A young architect who believed taking chances was the only way to create something extraordinary. A nurse interrupted with Rebecca's afternoon medications. As she administered them, she chatted about the shelter renovation. Her brother, newly sober, had just entered the culinary training program there. The new kitchen design is amazing, the nurse said. All that natural light, the teaching spaces. Whoever designed it really understood what people need to heal. Michael squeezed Rebecca's hand as the nurse left. They hadn't publicly revealed his role in the design yet, or Rebecca's identity as the foundation's owner. Those revelations waited, along with so many others. Speaking of taking chances, Rebecca said, pulling out her own set of papers from beside the bed. Her legal team had prepared them, documents that would reveal her ownership of the Chen Group, expose Marshall's crimes, and permanently link her name to every project she'd anonymously founded. Once I sign these, she said, there's no going back. Everything changes. Everything's already changed. Michael gestured around the hospital room at the get well cards from shelter residents who knew her only as a board member, at the success stories still displayed on her wall. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Rebecca reached for the experimental protocol consent forms. Her hand trembled slightly, a side effect of the current treatment, but her signature was firm. When do we start? She asked Dr. Martinez. We can begin tomorrow. But you should know, This will be harder than what you've been through so far. You'll need support." "She has it," Michael said, and Rebecca heard the architect's certainty in his voice, the same tone he used when describing a building's perfect form. That evening, as Rebecca dozed between medication rounds, Michael worked on updated shelter plans. The renovation had continued in their absence, guided by his designs, but enriched by constant feedback from residents. He'd learned that the best buildings, like the best healing, came from listening to those who would use the space. He looked up to find Rebecca watching him sketch. "Remember that all-nighter we pulled senior year?" she asked. "The community center project? You kept insisting we needed more windows." He smiled at the memory. "Said every room should have a view of the future. Look at us now, both getting second chances at the view." Her phone buzzed again. Marshall had been detained in Singapore. The evidence they'd gathered had been enough. Rebecca read the message with quiet satisfaction, then turned back to the experimental protocol papers. "Dr. Martinez says the first treatment begins at dawn," she said. "Will you stay?" Michael set aside his sketches. "Try to make me leave." Through the hospital window they could see the shelter in the distance, its renovation slowly taking shape. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, medical, legal, personal. The experimental treatment would test her strength, the public revelations would test her courage. But tonight, in this room, they had everything they needed. Hope in the protocol, papers, truth in the legal documents, and love in the space between them. "You know," Rebecca said sleepily, "for an architect and a developer, we spent a lot of time tearing things down lately." "Sometimes," Michael replied, thinking of all the walls that had fallen between them. "That's how you create room for something better to rise." The hospital's sunroom had become their impromptu studio. Between Rebecca's treatments, they spread blueprints across tables meant for healing plants, their shared vision taking shape in pencil lines and possibility. "If we extend this wing," Michael said, sketching quickly, "the shelter connects directly to the new community center. No more artificial barriers between those needing help and those offering it." Rebecca, wrapped in a soft blanket against the treatment's chills, added her own notes to the margins. The experimental protocol was harsh, but it was working, just like their nascent plans for something larger than a simple shelter renovation. "What if we made it a prototype?" She pointed to the design. "The first of a network, each one adapted to its community's needs, but all built on the same principle of integration." Her phone buzzed. Marshall had begun talking to authorities in Singapore. The evidence they'd gathered had cracked his resolve. But that news seemed distant now, less urgent than the work before them. "Look at this," Michael said, pulling up the shelter's latest success statistics on his tablet. 87% of residents who participated in job training programs have found stable employment. The culinary program has a waiting list. Rebecca studied the numbers, her developer's mind, seeing patterns. "With the right design, we could double the capacity. Not just here, but everywhere we build these." She met his eyes. The question held more than business implications. After her recovery, after the truth came out, after all the walls fell, what would they be to each other? Her answer came, in the form of a new set of papers. Not blueprints this time, but incorporation documents for a joint venture. Sullivan Chen Community Development. "I had my lawyers draw these up," she said. "Equal partnership. Your design expertise, my resources. Building things right this time." Michael's hands stilled on the blueprints. "You're serious? The Chen Group has the contracts and connections. You have the vision and community trust. Together," she gestured at their shared design, "we could make real change." Before he could respond, Dr. Martinez arrived with Rebecca's latest test results. The experimental treatment was exceeding expectations. Her cancer was responding, healing becoming more than just a hope. "Your numbers are impressive," the doctor said. "Whatever you're doing between treatments, keep doing it. Building a future." Rebecca replied, and felt the truth of it in more ways than one. After the doctor left, they returned to their work. The design had evolved beyond just a shelter. Now it incorporated education spaces, health services, job training facilities, a complete ecosystem of support and opportunity. "You realize," Michael said, adding detail to a communal garden space, "once we announce this partnership, everything changes. Your identity, my past, it'll all come out. It's time." Rebecca touched the incorporation papers. "I'm tired of hiding. From who I am, from what I feel." The moment hung between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Michael's phone chimed, a message from Marcus, the aspiring engineer. He'd been accepted into a summer architecture program. "He wants to intern with us," Michael smiled. "Says he has ideas for the youth spaces in the new design." "Our first employee? Our first partner." Michael pointed to a section of the blueprints. "These spaces aren't just for helping people. They're for empowering them to help design their own futures." Rebecca looked at their joint work, the architectural plans, the incorporation documents, the future taking shape in lines and words and shared purpose. Everything she'd hidden from for 15 years now stood revealed. Her identity, her feelings, her hope. Through the sunroom's windows, they could see the city stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, reporters were already getting wind of Marshall's confession. Soon, the stories would break. The reclusive billionaire, the wronged architect, their reconnection and redemption. But here, in this room filled with healing plants and shared dreams, they were building something that transcended headlines. Every line they drew together was a promise. Every space they designed held possibility. "Partner," Rebecca said, tasting. The words many meanings, in business, in purpose, in life. Michael's hand found hers across the blueprints. Outside, Seattle's afternoon light caught their joint design, casting the future's shadow across pages of promise. The day Rebecca completed her final treatment, Michael brought her a small wooden box. She recognized it immediately, the handmade puzzle box he'd given her on graduation day, before everything fell apart. "You kept it?" Her fingers traced the intricate patterns he'd carved himself. "Found it in my old portfolio at the shelter." He watched as she remembered the combination, their anniversary date, and opened it. Inside lay a simple silver ring, green with tarnish. Not valuable by any monetary standard, but priceless in memory. He'd given it to her their senior year, not as an engagement ring, but as a promise of one someday. "I pawned this," she whispered. After everything. To help fund my first anonymous foundation." "I know." Michael sat beside her hospital bed. "The pawnshop owner told me when I came looking. Said a young woman in expensive clothes sold it for far less than it was worth, then donated the money to a homeless shelter." Rebecca lifted the ring, remembering. "That shelter became my first renovation project, the beginning of everything I built, everything we're rebuilding now." He took the ring from her trembling fingers. The tremors weren't from illness anymore. Her last scan had shown complete remission. These tremors came from something deeper. Through the window, they could see reporters gathering outside the hospital. The story had finally broken. Marshall's confession, Rebecca's true identity, their shared past, and renewed partnership. The world was hungry for details, but they'd kept this moment private. "I've been thinking," Michael said, holding the ring, "about that promise we made. No more secrets, remember?" "I remember breaking it." "We both did. Me with my pride, you with your walls. But now," he looked at the ring, then back at her, "now we know the cost of walls and the value of truth." Rebecca touched the box again. "The combination still works. Some things are built to last." He smiled. "Even when the builders lose their way." The ring caught the afternoon light, its tarnish somehow making it more beautiful, more real. Like them, it bore the marks of time and trial, but its essence remained true. "The Sullivan Chen project launches next week," Rebecca said. "Our first joint venture." "That's not the joint. A venture I'm thinking about." Michael's voice was soft. 15 years ago, I promised you forever. I didn't understand then what that meant. about fighting for love, not just falling into it, about building something strong enough to weather storms. He held up the ring. I'm not asking for the answer we thought we knew back then. I'm asking for the one we've earned now, the one that comes with scars and wisdom and second chances. Rebecca looked at the ring, remembering the young woman who'd first worn it, so afraid of being loved for her wealth that she'd hidden her true self. Now, with her identity public and her walls down, she faced a different fear, the magnificent terror of being loved completely, scars and all. The papers will have a field day, she said. Billionaire developer marries homeless architect. Let them. We're better at building than hiding now. Outside, the reporter crowd grew. Soon they would need to face them, to tell their story of redemption and renewal. The business world was already buzzing about Sullivan Chen community development. Their integrated shelter design had attracted international attention. But here, in this moment, they were just Michael and Rebecca, holding a tarnished ring that had traveled through time to find its way home. "Ask me," she whispered. Michael slid from his chair to one knee, still holding the ring. No grand gestures, no elaborate speeches. They'd outgrown the need for those. "Marry me," he said simply, "not because of who we were, but because of who we've become, partners in everything." Rebecca held out her hand, steady now. The ring slid on, as if the 15 years between had been nothing but a pause for breath. "Yes," she said, "partner." The ring might have been tarnished, but it shone with the light of second chances, like their joint projects, like their shared future. It was more beautiful for having survived the storm. The morning of the groundbreaking ceremony dawned clear and bright. Michael stood at the shelter's entrance, reviewing the final plans one last time. The drawings had evolved from simple renovation sketches to a comprehensive blueprint for change. "Everything ready?" Rebecca joined him, looking strong and confident after her recovery. She wore a simple blazer over jeans, no more hiding behind carefully cultivated poverty, but no flashy displays of wealth either. Just herself, finally. Marcus made some last-minute adjustments to the youth center design. Michael showed her their former students' contributions. "He's got real talent." The shelter's courtyard had been transformed for the ceremony. Where there had once been cracked concrete, a detailed outline of the new buildings had been painted in bright colors, each space labeled with its purpose: training kitchen, education center, health services, community gardens. Tom approached with a group of current residents, all wearing T-shirts with the Sullivan Chen Community Development logo. "The press is setting up, and you both need to see this." He handed them a stack of papers. Testimonials from shelter residents, past and present. Stories of lives changed, hope restored, futures reclaimed. At the top sat a letter from Marcus, now officially their first architectural intern. "What you're building here isn't just buildings," Rebecca read aloud. "It's proof that rock bottom can become a foundation." The groundbreaking plans spread out before them showed more than just physical structures. Each element had been designed with input from the community it would serve. The culinary program's kitchen layout came from residents who'd worked in restaurants. The classroom spaces reflected teachers who'd found themselves homeless after retirement. "Ms. Chen!" A group of children ran up, students from the after-school program Michael had tutored. "Are you really going to build a science lab?" "Even better," Michael answered for her. "You're going to help design it." Rebecca watched him with the kids, his architect's enthusiasm matching their excitement as he showed them where their ideas had been incorporated into the plans. No trace remained of the broken man she'd first re-encountered in the rain. His restoration, like hers, had come through giving back what they'd nearly lost. The ceremony crowd grew. Shelter residents, community leaders, former success stories, returned to help others. Reporters too, but they were secondary now. The real story wasn't in headlines about the billionaire and the homeless architect finding love again. It was in the faces of people whose lives would be changed by what they were building. "Ready, partner?" Michael asked, as they took their places for the ceremony. Rebecca squeezed his hand, feeling the warm metal of his ring. Ready. Together, they stepped forward to share their vision, not just for this shelter, but for the network of integrated community centers that would follow, each one built on the principles they'd learned through loss and redemption, that true shelter meant more than walls and roofs, that every person deserved a chance to rebuild, that the strongest foundations were built on second chances. As they turned the first ceremonial shovelful of earth, Rebecca caught sight of their reflection in the shelter's windows. No more shadows, no more hiding. Just two people who had found their way back to themselves by helping others find their way forward. The groundbreaking plans fluttered in the morning breeze, their shared vision ready to rise from paper into reality. And in every line, every carefully considered space, beat the heart of a simple truth. Sometimes love builds better. Things the second time around. A year later, under a bright Seattle sky, Rebecca and Michael stood in the completed shelter's courtyard. String lights twinkled overhead, and flowers bloomed in the community gardens where their wedding guests now gathered. The celebration was exactly what they'd wanted. Not a society event, but a community one. On a table near the entrance, displayed in a simple frame, lay the newly signed Sullivan Chen Foundation Charter. Its purpose was spelled out in clear, strong lines, to provide not just shelter but opportunity, not just buildings but communities, not just hope but the tools to build a future. Marcus, now completing his first year of engineering school, had been the one to suggest holding the wedding here. "Where else?" he'd said. "This is where everything came full circle." He was right. The shelter's transformation mirrored their own. The institutional walls had given way to warm, welcoming spaces. The old barriers between helper and helped had dissolved into a community of mutual support. Every corner held stories of renewal. Annie, whose cancer battle had paralleled Rebecca's, now ran the shelter's health advocacy program. The former, Chef, who'd found sobriety, was training a new class of culinary students. Tom, still directing it all, had tears in his eyes as he gave the wedding toast. "Love builds better things the second time around," he said, echoing words that had become the Foundation's unofficial motto. These two proved that, not just with this building, but with every life they've helped rebuild. The shelter residents had insisted on contributing to the celebration. The wedding feast came from the culinary program's kitchen. The decorations were crafted in art therapy classes. Even the music was provided by a resident band, their songs speaking of hope and second chances. Rebecca, in a simple white dress that would have scandalized her corporate board, looked around at what they'd built. Not just the physical structure, though that exceeded even their original vision, but the community within it. The lives transformed. The futures reclaimed. Michael squeezed her hand, understanding in his eyes. They'd both learned that the strongest buildings rose not from wealth or acclaim, but from the steady work of helping others rise. Their foundation charter wasn't just a document, it was a promise to keep building that legacy. The evening deepened into night. Stories were shared, lives celebrated. A young mother who'd arrived broken now showed off her nursing school acceptance. A teenager proudly displayed his first architectural sketch, each success adding another brick to the foundation they'd laid. As their guests danced under the stars, Michael and Rebecca slipped away to the quiet of his old office, the space where he'd first spread out renovation plans, where she'd first struggled with revealing her identity, had become something new too. A place where future architects would learn to design with compassion, where business students would study ethical development. The foundation charter caught the lamplight, its fresh ink still gleaming. Below the mission statement, a simple truth. Every end can be a beginning. Every rock bottom can become a foundation. Every wall can become a door. They didn't need to speak. The years of separation had taught them the value of silence shared, of understanding that ran deeper than words. Their rings caught the light as their hands met on the charter. Not an ending, but a continuation. A promise that what they'd built here would keep growing, keep helping, keep offering others the second chances they'd found themselves. Outside, Seattle's lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, each one marking a place where future shelters would rise, where more lives would be transformed. Their love story had become larger than themselves, building hope one restored life at a time. The foundation charter was their legacy, but the real foundation was in the hearts of those they'd helped, in Marcus's determined pursuit of his dreams, in Annie's compassionate guidance of others facing illness, in every person who'd found at rock bottom not an ending, but a place to start building something new. Together, they returned to their celebration, to the community that had helped them find their way back to each other, to the future they would keep building, one life, one chance, one renewed hope at a time. Some love stories end with happily ever after, but the best ones, like the strongest buildings, never really end at all. They just keep growing, keep sheltering, keep proving that with the right foundation, anything is possible.